Hi everyone, Talia from Zart Art, and today we're going to be creating a weaving on a cardboard weaving loom. So here I have our little cardboard weaving looms that we'll be using. So if I just pop this shape very carefully, pop this shape out from our loom, we'll be creating a weaving that will sit behind this design. So we'll get a little cockatoo shape, and of course you can use that for other art projects, but I'll just leave that to the side. And also you can get these little koala shaped ones as well, which make for a really fun activity, but we'll be working on our cockatoo today. So when we're creating our weaving, we'll be using some wool, so a few different colors, and I'm going to show you a few different techniques for changing colors and changing some of the shapes in your loom. To begin, we're going to be creating the warp in our loom. So this is what we'll be using to thread our wool through. So to create our warp, I'm just going to take a length of wool, and a hot tip is don't cut the wool yet because you always need more than what you think. Now I'm going to put the wool on the first tooth of my cardboard loom, and then I'm going to go directly vertical to the next part and then wrap it around the same tooth and continue that throughout my whole loom. Now when you are threading this through, you want a little bit of spring in these warp strings, but you don't want it to be too tight that it bends the cardboard. Now we're at the end, so what I'm going to do is just tie off these two ends together so that it will hold that shape. Okay, so make sure your ends are tied and that your loom has a bit of spring in your warp strings. You can just cut off any excess on those ends. So we will be creating our weave with our weft strings on this side. So the weft is the horizontal strings that will weave through the warp. So weft horizontal, warp is vertical. So we're going to be creating our design on this side, but you're going to see only the cutout area on the other side. So this is a really great project if you're just starting to learn how to do weaving, because it allows for a bit of mistakes, which is always helpful. So to begin, we're going to start with our first color, which will start from this end, and we're going to start with yellow because the crest of the cockatoo is usually yellow. Of course, you can do whatever color combinations you like. So I'm going to thread this through my large plastic needle, and you do want to use a large needle because our wool is quite thick and it's much easier to work with. So thread that through, and I'm going to take about an arm length of wool at a time, because if you do more than that, and you will need much more than that to weave through this, you will find that you get tangled and things become a little bit harder to control. So always start with small amounts. So I'm going to tie this to my warp string. So tie that. And we want to start about a centimetre or two below our teeth. And the reason for that is I'm going to manipulate these strings a little bit later on to get a bit of a cool shape. So allowing a bit of room at the top will give me enough room to actually move those around. Now when we are weaving or doing our weft, what you want to do is make sure you're going alternating over, under, over, under. And this is why a plastic needle is really helpful, because you can quite easily see and manipulate that needle going over, under, over, under. And you can pull that through. So if I had a very long woolen string that I'm working with, it would be much harder to keep it manageable. So just making a shorter wool thread is much easier. Now going back the other way, we're going to need to alternate. So I've gone over this last string, so I need to go under, over, under, over. So you'll see that that's alternating from my last string and reach the end and pull that through. Now, if you get it wrong and you're not paying much attention and you do the opposite, that's okay. It'll just undo your last piece of string. So that's going to be pretty annoying, but you can manage that and then just redo your weft. Now, when you are looping through and reaching the end, if you pull too hard, see how my warp has been altered and it's pulled it in. So this will affect your whole image and everything will come together and it will look a little bit funny. So just make sure that you have a little bit of give at the end, so don't pull it too tight, and if you do, just go back before you move on to your next step and pull it back so that warp thread is nice and vertical without coming in. Now, the beauty of weaving is once you get it, it can be quite a relaxing process, and now I'm going to spend quite a bit of time continuing my weave. But when we run out of wool, we'll stop there and I'll show you how to go about adding more wool to your work. So as you're doing your weft strings and you're weaving through, your strings might be sitting too high up. So I usually just use my needle, or you can use your fingers just to pull it back into a nice even thread. Okay, next step. So as you can see, I've started to run out of my wool. So I'm just going to untie that from my needle. Now just make sure that those warp strings aren't coming in. Line those up. And then what I'm going to do is just tie that to the end of my warp string to finish that off. Trim that off. And now we're still working on our yellow. You can see it's starting to show through on our cardboard loom. So get your yellow again. So get about an arm's length of yellow. And we're going to tie that back onto the end. And we're going to start off on the opposite end to where we've tied that one, just so we get nice even lines. So just a standard knot, pull it through. Make sure you tie it nice and close to your last thread, and you can cut off that excess. Then we're just going to tie the other end to our plastic needle and continue our weaving. I'm just about finished up with my yellow. So just to see the front of our design, you can see the yellow coming through there. And even though some of my warp strings have started to pull in a little bit, what's great about these looms is it's fine to have a little bit of pull because you've got a bit of card between where you'll actually see your weaving. So what I'm going to do now is just manipulate some of these threads because I want my crest to have a bit of an arc so it actually follows the line of the cockatoo's head. I'm just going to pull down some of these weft strings, so my horizontal strings down my warp and push some up. So I'm going to get a little bit of a rounded head. So just manipulate that here and there, and then you'll get a bit more of a cockatoo shaped head. So I can tie off my yellow thread, and then I'll start by creating a little bit of a beak shape with my grey. So I'll show you how to do that in a second. Finished up with my yellow. Now I'm going to do that little beak shape with my grey. Again, about an arm length. Trim that off. Tie that onto this side. Because I'm only doing a small patch of this in grey, make sure you do tie it on to the right side. Now making sure we're alternating from the last thread that we've done. So we're going to go under, over, and I'm going to stop at this thread here because I don't want my grey to go all the way through to the end. So just going to that thread and then making my way back, alternating the under, over so it doesn't unstitch my last weft, pushing that up. So there's no gaps in between my weft threads, and then going back to that same warp thread and then coming back and continuing that until I've made it all the way to the end of the beak. So now we've finished that grey area of our beak. Now the last colour that we'll be using is our white to fill in the rest of this empty space. So as we're creating our weft threads, we're just going to go up to this section and then go in between each thread to fill in that space here. So I'll thread my wool and show you as we get to that position. So now we're up to our grey area, so just going through that same warp thread that we ended on and going in between the stitches. So when the next time I come up to here, I'll be going through those ones and then just separate them, pull that through, and then we'll thread back, making sure we're alternating. So once you've finished off your weaving, just cut off any loose bits that you can see through the other side. But otherwise, that is our weaving completed. We've got our change of colors. You can move your wefts up your warps or down your warps if you want to just manipulate some of the shapes happening in your work, but I'm quite happy with how all of those weft threads are moving across the warps. So it's a fairly simple way of learning how to do a weaving, especially with this cardboard loom that allows for a few mistakes. If you do make any mistakes, or even if you pull some of the strings too hard, you won't be able to see those through that negative space that's in that card. But if you did want to make this a little bit simpler, then you could just stick to using a few different colors and just focusing on getting those wefts in a solid horizontal pattern and then changing colors every now and then. But otherwise, it's a fairly simple way of going about weaving. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.